Dr Jade, welcome to the Personal Best podcast.
Thank you for having me.
It's so nice to have you here in the studio. I have so many questions for you. You are a licensed psychologist.
I am.
And you run your own clinic here in London, which is amazing. And there's just so much that I want to talk to you about. I feel like this is going to end up being a free therapy session for me and probably for all of our listeners as well. But I want to jump straight in and ask you, why are our emotions so hard to understand?
Oh, good place to start. I think our emotions are so hard to understand for many different reasons. I think firstly, lots of people don't get taught from childhood how to name and understand and then regulate their emotions. So I think it often does originate in childhood, and then obviously if you've got a child that struggles to regulate or understand or name their emotions and they become an adult, and then that adult has their own children, they don't know what to model or what to teach. And it's also one of those things that it's not really taught in schools. I think it's getting better, but it isn't something that is taught in schools. And I think emotions are so complex because lots of emotions almost contradict one another. So it's really easy to feel, for example, like a sense of love as well as a sense of anger and resentment at the same time. So that can be confusing for people as well. And an analogy that I use in practice with clients is that often you've got, for example, you might have anxiety and excitement at the same time. And I sometimes refer to them as like identical twins. And sometimes one of them stands in front of the other and you don't know which one's which. So you can maybe think of a time that you felt excited about something, but you have a little twang of anxiety underneath that as well. And the same might be with anger and vulnerability. So whenever people describe their feelings of anger, I'll always ask them maybe where their vulnerability lies as well, because again, it's two emotions that can be coexisting at the same time. So I think there's lots of different reasons why emotions are so complex. So it comes from, obviously originates in childhood and that education around it, but then also they're just a bit of a minefield at times.
Yeah, exactly. And obviously it goes without saying that we all experience, a wide range of emotions.
Yeah.
And like you said, we just don't really have that emotional education to understand them very well. And I think some people maybe have been taught by parents or teachers or people in their life how to process and regulate their emotions. But some of us haven't had that. And like you said, then that overspills into adulthood and we haven't ever learned how to actually process those things properly. And it's funny as well, you said how emotions can kind of coexist, because actually the feeling is kind of the same in our body. Like the feeling of being excited where your heart's racing a little bit and maybe you're pumped with adrenaline, that's kind of the same as those feelings of anxiety. So it can get so confusing sometimes.
Biologically, it is exactly the same of what happens in your body when you're excited versus when you're anxious. The difference is one of them is a very positive emotion and one of them can be a very negative emotion. But that's why it's confusing, because actually from a physical perspective, it's doing the same thing to our body. So sometimes just having the understanding of that they can coexist at the same time, it's completely normal. But to have that understanding is really helpful at times, and that's a big part of therapy as well, is sometimes the psychoeducation.
Definitely. And I think sometimes as well we're kind of limited in our language that we use to talk about and describe our emotions. Like some days you might just wake up feeling a bit off and you can't really describe why or what that feeling is, but it's just there. It's kind of like this cloud that's just hanging over you. And I think that's where talking therapy is so important, because it allows you to kind of have those open conversations with a professional and kind of work through them. I think I probably do that almost too much as someone who's quite guilty of overthinking, is constantly trying to play detective with my emotions and be like, okay, what am I feeling? Why am I feeling this way? Like, what can I do about it? But I guess in your professional work, how do you help people process these emotions better?
The first thing is always education. So I often explain it to the people that I'm working with that I'll use a 3-step process. So education is step 1. Step 2 is awareness and building that self-awareness. And then step 3 is practice. So education, awareness and practice. And so I'm just the type of practitioner that likes to give a lot of psychoeducation, because I think it's really helpful for people to understand what they are going through and why and where that might be coming from. Sometimes that's actually all they need. They might not need the practical strategies and tools. It might just be that they need to have a level of understanding, because once you've got that understanding, you can deal with it better.
Yeah.
So that would always be the process that I'd follow. But also, I guess with the awareness and education side of things would be identifying triggers. So what is it so if you're feeling a sense of anxiety or you're feeling a sense of anger, okay, what's triggered that? And sometimes, like you said, it's like being a detective. And often clients will sit there and they'll say to me, nothing's triggered it. And I'll say, we don't just feel emotions for no reason. We feel emotions. It might be something really small that you haven't even picked up on. And often, more times than not, there's many different triggers. It's not just one thing that you can like pinpoint and go, oh yeah, it's that. Sometimes it is, but often there's like many different layers to it. So yeah, that would be where we'd start. And then obviously once we've got that identification, we've got that understanding, then the processing work can happen as to, okay, why might that have triggered you so much? You know, why might it have brought up those feelings of anger in you? What is it that might be underlying? And then it goes back to what I said before of thinking about maybe what other emotions might be coming up as well. So the complexities within that of, you know, if you're feeling a sense of anger, where is that vulnerability lying? What is it that you're feeling vulnerable about? And then, okay, well, what can we do about it? The practice side of things. What can we do? What strategies can we put in place? Is there anything in your life that you can, from a practical standpoint, change? Or actually, sometimes that's not needed. It's just a sense of understanding and processing.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that tends to be the framework, I guess, of what that might look like in clinical work.
Yeah, I really like that. And I think that self-introspection is so important because there are so many different layers to it, and sometimes it isn't always obvious to us. But I think often it's kind of in our nature to want to suppress and avoid any negative emotions. So when we feel anger or we feel jealousy or something, we don't want to have to deal with that and we kind of push it down. Why do you think we get stuck in negative thought patterns?
Well, I often say that we are very pattern-orientated creatures as humans. We repeat patterns constantly, and we repeat patterns because it feels comfortable to us, and our brains are a little bit lazy at times, and they don't like the idea of change, and we just repeat patterns because it feels comfortable, and that's what we know. Even if those patterns might be not helpful to us, we still just repeat the pattern because that's all we know. And actually, sometimes it feels harder to unlearn that pattern of behaviour. So actually, it's a lot easier to repeat a very negative pattern of behaviour or pattern of thinking than it is to almost rewire our brain. And so it can be that, yeah, we're getting stuck in those cycles because it's easier. And then the work that comes with unlearning that is quite difficult. And for a lot of people, they might have been repeating those patterns since childhood. So I'll often say to clients, they'll be like, you know, how quickly is this process going to work? And I'll say, well, it depends. You know, if you're carrying around a pattern of your thinking that's unhelpful, that you've carried since childhood, and you're now in your 30s or your 40s, unfortunately, it's going to take a lot longer than a couple of weeks to unlearn that, because you're just unlearning the way that you think about something and relearning a new pattern.
Yeah.
And you're also creating new neural pathways in your brain as well, because repetition creates those neural pathways. So the more you've repeated something, the more those neural pathways become really fixed in your brain. So yeah, it's a hard process, but that's why we get stuck in those patterns.
That's super interesting, and it makes sense as to why people end up getting stuck in like a toxic or like an unhealthy relationship, or they don't leave a job that's maybe causing them like stress, because it's so familiar to us. And like you said, we don't like change. We'd rather stick with something that's familiar and not perfect than something that is uncertain and a bit more scary. And I think the childhood thing is also really interesting. And I heard Alan de Botton, I'm not sure if you're familiar with his work, Alan de Botton from the School of Life. He said that the way we react as adults often made a lot of sense when we were children. So, for example, if you had unreliable parents, you might learn to not depend on others and maybe like push people away. How do you help people kind of, as you say, unlearn those maybe unhelpful behavior patterns and try and find better ones?
Well, again, it goes back to them having to identify that that's where they're at, because a lot of people will come to therapy, and often people come to therapy because something's going on in their present life. So it's very rare that you get people that will sit and just reflect and think, do you know what? My life right now feels really calm and like collected, but actually I've got some trauma from like way back in my childhood. So I'm going to go to therapy to deal with that. It's often something's happened in their present life that's triggered it, whether that be a bereavement, whether that be a change at work, whether that be a breakup in a relationship. Something's happened in their present life that's maybe tapping into those previous patterns. And often people aren't really aware of it. And then that's where therapy comes in to identify, okay, well, and I guess it's one of those things, why do psychologists and therapists always talk about childhood? That's why, because we're able to then make those links that maybe people haven't made before. So, yeah, that would be where it would start, would be helping them to identify that actually those patterns have probably emerged from their childhood, 9 times out of 10, I would say. And then it's, okay, well, identifying and reminding them that you're not a child anymore. You're an adult and you have a completely different life than you did when you were a child, and you don't need to feel like, I don't know, like you're being controlled by somebody anymore, because actually you're an adult and you can make your own decisions and you have your own house, and you're not dependent on those people anymore. So it's almost getting them to differentiate where they were at as a child versus where they're at as an adult, and then they can start and make those behavioural changes as well. But it's long-term work when you start delving into that. You're looking more at like psychodynamic long-term therapy work, which is really transformative, but unfortunately it doesn't just happen like really quickly, which is what people hope for.
Yeah, of course. Like one therapy session, trauma gone.
Yeah.
I'm fine.
Yeah.
But I think that is really interesting. It's definitely something that I've thought about personally. I've been doing therapy recently, and obviously we have delved into my childhood, and it's funny, there's things that you don't even remember, or things that feel so insignificant now that actually when you were a child probably were really important and really pivotal in shaping like who you are as an adult.
Yeah.
And something else I did want to ask you is, how do you help people move through these quite difficult life events? We might call them traumas, but I did hear a clip of you saying that a trauma is basically anything that kind of shakes up the way you think about yourself or a relationship or the world around you. It doesn't have to be what we would typically presume to be traumatic.
Yeah.
How do you help people navigate through those difficult situations?
Yeah, I think in terms of, what I describe a trauma to be, I think when the word trauma gets thrown around, people almost panic and they think, oh, I haven't been traumatized, or I haven't had a trauma, because it's such a heavy word at times. And actually, the way that I explain trauma to the people that I'm working with, or the way that I frame it in any of my work, is anything that shatters your core belief system. So your core beliefs, that we all have core beliefs, we all hold core beliefs about ourselves, other people, and the world around us. So any event in your life that can come and completely shatter those beliefs. So that might be something like a relationship breakdown. That might be something like a bereavement. That might be something like a catastrophizing event. So the scale of what a trauma might be can be so varied for people. And everybody will experience some level of that in their life. And I think when you say that to people, that everybody will experience trauma in their life, that's really scary, because we don't want to experience it, of course not. But we do, and that is the reality. And it is part of life. But in terms of how you work through that, obviously, ideally, it's with somebody who's trained in trauma, because trauma is very complex. And it is something that I specialise in my work, because it can bring up so many conflicting emotions, almost like what we were talking about at the beginning. It can be so complex, and there's so many different layers to it. So if you can, it's not something I would recommend to try and do yourself. To try and work, sit down and work through trauma yourself. If you can do it with a licensed therapist or a psychologist, then that's great. Again, it would be, I always start by, in any of my trauma work, helping them to have an understanding of what trauma is. So again, going back to that psychoeducation. So exactly what I've just mentioned, understanding that actually what they've been through is traumatic, and the reason they might be experiencing all these conflicting emotions is completely normal. Because I think often people think there's something wrong with them.
Yeah. Or carry shame with them.
Yeah. So that would always be where I'd start. And then it depends on, I guess, the approach. There's lots of different approaches to trauma, and there's lots of different therapies that you can have for trauma as well. I use an integrative model, so I use a combination of CBT, trauma-focused CBT, but also psychodynamic as well, psychodynamic approach. And I often describe it to clients as, if you imagine the trauma to be like a jigsaw puzzle, and all the pieces are like scattered all over the floor. Some of the work, or at least at the beginning, is putting those pieces together to help it, form a picture, so that you have a coherent understanding as to what happened. And that in itself can take time, because again, when we go through any kind of trauma, it can leave gaps in our memory. Over time as well, we might have changed the narrative. And it's all your brain just trying to protect you. It's actually a very normal thing that your brain's doing, and your brain's trying to be helpful, is how I sometimes phrase it to clients. But it can be quite difficult to put those pieces together and to form a coherent understanding of what that trauma looks like. And then it would be then moving into more of the processing work. So focusing on, okay, well, what's the meaning behind that? Because when we go through anything traumatic, we usually take away a meaning. And that's when it alters our core belief system, is we then hold a meaning of maybe the world is no longer safe, or people can't be trusted, for example. So then what we're doing is we're working with the meaning rather than the context of what happened.
Yeah, that's so interesting, actually, how like one singular event, or, a series of difficult events do change our beliefs, like you say, and also maybe that impacts our relationships if we're like less trusting of people, or we think more negatively because there's bad situations happen. But I guess part of the work is like kind of changing that into something that's a bit more positive. And it's so hard, because especially when you're in the middle of something difficult, it doesn't seem like there's any silver lining there to be found. But actually, often once you have been able to move past it and you have been able to process it, you can see like what it's taught you. And I guess that's something that I've tried to share with people, is rather than thinking, why is this thing happening to me? It's, what is this trying to teach me? Like, what are some of the lessons that I can take away from this very difficult thing that will hopefully allow me to become a bit stronger? Yeah,
definitely. And everything as well in our life is experience. So, relationships are a great example of this. Every relationship teaches you something, and that doesn't just have to be romantic relationships. It can be friendships as well. It can be family relationships. Every relationship teaches us something. It might teach you what you do or don't want in a partner, for example, when you then move into your next relationship. It might teach you things about yourself. So I think trying to frame it in that way can be really helpful. Depends on the trauma, but that's almost the end point that you want to get to, I think, with any kind of trauma work, as to we're not trying to change the way you think about it and, change a negative to a positive, because that's not realistic.
Yeah.
And I'll sometimes say that to clients. We're not trying to get you to look back and think, oh, yeah, that was a great thing that happened to me, because it probably wasn't. And that's fine to say, you know, for you to look back and say, that was a really rubbish thing that happened to me, or that was a really difficult thing. But the point is of trauma work is that you are able to then follow it with, but I'm not there anymore and I'm not stuck in that anymore. So it's not that we're trying to, I think sometimes CBT can get confused of that. People are like, oh, it's just changing like negatives into positives. It's not quite that easy, unfortunately.
Yeah.
It's about that you can look back and almost look back with more of a neutralized view, so that you can look back and think, yeah, that was really hard, but I've come through it. Maybe I've taken X, Y, Z away from it. This is what I've learned, and I'm no longer in that place now. Because with trauma, we get stuck there as well often.
Definitely. I guess it's that like self-acceptance thing, and also like accepting that that was, like you said, a really difficult traumatic experience, but I made it through and I'm dealing with it and I can be stronger because of it. Something else I want to ask you is, how can we be kinder to ourselves? As we've said, we get so stuck in negative thought patterns. And I think this is particularly common in like high achievers and go-getters and people who have that drive. They often can berate themselves for not doing enough and feeling like they're not achieving enough. It's definitely something that I've dealt with and I've spoken to about a lot with other people on the podcast. Yeah. How can we be nicer to ourselves?
Good question. Good question, and I guess quite a big topic, and probably, something that everybody wants to know. And I think, you know, if you could bottle it up in a very simplistic answer, you could probably sell it for a lot of money. But I think in terms of being kinder to ourselves, I often talk about in, you know, with my clients, but also in any media work that I've done, about inner critics and inner bullies. And we all have one. And sometimes I'll even get clients to name them, which is often a very like creative, fun way to introduce it. But actually, if you identify what that inner critic is, and by that I mean that internal voice that is your inner bully that might say those things to you like, oh, you could have done better on that. Why did you do that? Why did you say that? And I mean, that can range from being really negative to, you know, being vile to people. Some people have really vile inner bullies, really. So I think firstly, identify it and identify the kind of things that your inner bully or inner critic might say to you. And if you can, give it a name. It can be anything. It can be, you know, a fictional name or anything like that. Sometimes people will say like Cruella or something. And then every time you notice it, it's about building up that self-awareness, like you mentioned. Every time you notice that voice inside of your mind saying it, you've got to almost identify that that is not you, that is Cruella. And that's when you start to learn to separate it. And often I'll do chair work with clients, which again is like a very creative way of introducing this idea. But chair work essentially is like, it's almost like couples therapy with their inner critic. But I'll get them to switch from chair to chair, and they'll be themselves and then they'll be their inner critic. And it's always very, it's always a very insightful experience, and often people get very emotional about it because I think they don't realise until they're sat in that inner critic chair how awful they might actually speak to themselves and where that's coming from and why. And often when I ask them why, they'll say, as the person as the inner critic, they'll say, well, I just want the best for them. I'm trying to encourage them. So it's coming from a positive place.
Is that how you'd encourage other people?
Exactly my point. So then I'll always say, okay, so if I was to give you like £1 million to motivate somebody or encourage somebody to do their best, how would you talk to them? And they'd say, well, you know, I'd be really positive. And I'd say, okay, well, you wouldn't say, what's wrong with you? You're such a failure. Get on with it. Because you wouldn't get the £1 million that's on the table for you. But equally, you wouldn't go completely the other end of the scale where you'd go, oh, do you know what? Don't worry about it. Start on Monday. Yeah, no worries. you would have some kind of middle ground. And I'll sometimes say to people, especially if they've got children, how would you speak to a child? You wouldn't be completely aggressive to them, but you also wouldn't be completely passive either. You would be in some place in the middle, which is assertive. You'd be firm, but you'd be kind with it. And that's how we should be practice speaking to ourselves, which is often not how we're speaking to ourselves at all.
Yeah, no, can definitely relate to that. I had Mo Gowda on the podcast a while ago, and he says the same thing about naming the inner critic, and he calls it his Becky brain. I think Becky was like maybe a bit of a bully in school, which is where the name came from.
Yeah.
But yeah, the way he talks about it is so interesting because it just detaches you from that negative voice a little bit. And often you can then end up having a bit of a conversation with the inner critic as well. So if they do say like, oh, you've not done good enough at work this week, you can question it and be like, well, is that true? Like, why do you think that? Or, oh, you look ugly in that. But this isn't factual information. This is just that like nagging voice in our head. Yeah. And something that I've started to do, which might sound a bit lame to some people, is when I have moments of feeling good about myself, maybe my appearance, or I feel confident about something, or I've had a good workout, or anything, moments of inspiration, I actually write a note on my phone of how I was feeling, so that when I have the more negative days, I can look back and remember that it's only fleeting. Yeah, I just think it's really important to remind ourselves that it's so normal and that actually our negative thoughts aren't true, but they can seem quite loud certain times.
And again, in therapy, that's what we focus on. I'll sometimes ask clients, okay, do you have any factual evidence for that thought? And I'll say we deal with facts, we don't deal with assumptions. And often our thoughts are based on assumption. And I think just going back to your point of naming the inner critic as maybe somebody that, I don't know, from your past or that I'll sometimes say, does this inner critic sound like anybody familiar? Does it sound like anybody in your life currently or maybe in your past? And sometimes that can be quite informative to people as well, because they realise that actually that's not their voice. That's maybe come from, I don't know, a teacher or a bully or sometimes a parent. So yeah, that's why it's really important. It sounds silly to like name it, but actually if you start to really have a think about it, it can be really interesting as to where you get to with that.
Taking care of your mental well-being is one of the best things you can do to become your personal best. That's why I'm excited about BetterHelp, the paid partners of this podcast. BetterHelp is on a mission to make therapy easier. For me, therapy was something I considered for a long time before finally taking the leap. At first, I wasn't sure what to expect, but just having a safe space to talk and unpack my thoughts has been a real game changer. But the biggest thing I've learned is you don't have to wait for things to be unbearable to reach out for help. Therapy isn't just for when you're struggling, it's also an amazing tool for personal growth, gaining clarity, and building confidence in yourself. BetterHelp is an online therapy platform connecting you with credentialed therapists from the comfort of your home. To get started, just fill out a quick questionnaire and you'll be matched with a therapist within as little as a couple of days. And if the first one isn't quite right, you can switch therapists anytime without any awkward breakups. If you're ready to give therapy a try, then head to betterhelp.com/personalbest and receive 10% off your first month of therapy. Now let's get back to the episode. Looking at my own upbringing and experiences, I feel so fortunate that I've always been supported and given that emotional support and love by my family, but also been encouraged by teachers in school and like people around me that, I don't know, believe in me and have that confidence in me. But then I wonder, is that negative voice almost chiming in because there's an expectation to live up to there?
Yeah, maybe. And often that is where it comes from, especially high achievers.
Yeah.
That negative voice comes in. And like I said before, it's coming in because it's coming from a positive place, because it's trying to encourage you. But actually, as we said, that's not how you talk to somebody if you're trying to encourage them. Yeah. And again, it almost circles back to what we were talking about at the beginning, as to unlearning and relearning a new pattern of thinking. it's exactly the same thing. You've almost got to unlearn that way of talking to yourself and relearn more of an inner cheerleader way of talking to yourself. And it's also about understanding that you do have both, and that's okay. But as long as you can balance it out by having both the inner critic and the inner cheerleader, then that's sort of where you want to find that neutral ground.
Yeah, that's a really nice metaphor to use, and I'll definitely remember that next time I'm being harsh on myself. There's something else that I guess is slightly linked to that is how can we build more self-confidence? I think it's something that a lot of people struggle with, and we often just want one simple answer that's going to help us be more confident. And I've heard you also speak on the difference between external and internal validation. I wonder if you could just touch on that topic and maybe how that relates to feeling confident.
Yeah, of course. I think internal and external validation is such a big thing, particularly in this day and age with the likes of social media and everybody seeing people's achievements and sort of seeing the highlights of people's lives. And it very much taps into that external validation. Everyone wants a piece of that. As I've said before, it can give us that dopamine hit that we really want, and that can become addictive, and that can become an addictive cycle. So the more claps you get or the more likes you get on a post, the more likely you are to do it again, because you think, oh, that felt good for a brief moment, so I'm gonna do it again. But then what happens when we don't get that is that inner critic comes in. Oh yeah, that's because that wasn't as good. So it's a really difficult one. But I think in terms of how we become more confident, it's several factors really. I think we've got to focus on the internal validation. So how are you internally validating yourself? What's that inner cheerleader telling you? And also, when it comes to internal validation as well, it's like, what makes you feel good? Forget other people for a second, forget what's going to get all those likes on Instagram. What makes you feel good? What gives you a sense of achievement? Because you might, by asking yourself that question, you might realise that a lot of the things you're doing for the validation of others.
Yeah.
And I think that is a cycle that unfortunately in today's society people can very easily get stuck in. And so I think, that's almost like step one of building your confidence. I think also thinking about the people that you're surrounded by as well can be really a huge thing to consider. Like you said, your upbringing, you're very grateful for being in like a supportive environment, which is huge for your confidence and huge to building people's resilience as well. But unfortunately, that's not the reality for everybody. And some people haven't had an upbringing in a supportive household, or it might be that they're in a relationship that isn't supportive either. And that can also feed into the inner critic as well. So that can start and bring up some of those inner critic thoughts, and then we think, okay, well, that's almost being validated by the people in our lives. Yeah, I'm not good enough. Yeah, that is, that people are right, I should be doing more. So I think there's lots of different layers to when it comes to building confidence.
Yeah, it's definitely not like a quick fix or like a flip we can switch and then suddenly we feel more confident. But I think just describing those differences between external and internal validation is so interesting, because I think we get confused sometimes.
Yeah.
And I'm sure we can all think of somebody who, I don't know, has a lot of money or buys nice designer things, eats at expensive restaurants, all of this, but they're still insecure. But it often gets mistaken for like, oh, they seem so confident, they've got everything figured out. But actually it's almost like sometimes masking that insecurity. Whereas I think working out, how can we feel confident within ourselves is so important. And I've heard you also speak about how that can tie into values. Like, what are the things that you value? And I heard Mark Manson say that sometimes you have to let your values fail you. And that's so interesting. Like, if you think the money and the success is going to make you happy and then it doesn't, that's actually a really important lesson. So I think sometimes it's figuring out like, what really matters to me? Like, how can I become the most confident version of myself?
Yeah. I love that about almost letting your values fail you.
Yeah.
Because I think sometimes what we think we want is completely different to actually what we do want. And that's like a lifelong experience
Yeah.
or journey that everybody's going to go on. You might go down one path and realize, oh, actually, this isn't quite what I thought it might be, or this is not actually what I want. And I think, hindsight's a wonderful thing as well. Sometimes we look back on things and we think, yeah, that was actually not right for me, or that wasn't meant to be, or it didn't make me as happy as I thought it did at the time. But values is such a huge thing, because when I have spoken about it before, we're very goal orientated as humans, and having goals is a great thing, and it gives us motivation and it gives us structure to our lives. But actually, if you are just living goal to goal, what about that time in between? Because you can't be achieving goals every single day of your life, like 365 days of the year. You might achieve small goals, great, but those big goals that you're going to be posting on social media and, on Instagram and LinkedIn and whatever it is, that can't happen every single day of your life. So what about that time in between? What, you're going to be unhappy until you reach that next goal, and then it's going to give you that small dopamine hit again. So I think that's why values work so important, because it is that in-between time. How are you living in between your goals? What is important to you? And are you living to those values? And sometimes when I do values work with clients, they'll realise that there's parts of their life that they're not living to those values. So then it's, okay, well, how can we make that change? So, yeah, it's always really interesting when we get talking about values.
Yeah, so interesting. And I had a previous guest on the show called Rory McDonald, and he is a life coach, but he particularly speaks to successful men who don't feel successful, is the way he describes it. And often these types of people, the type A's, like the driven individuals, will like drive themselves into the ground to get a high achieving job that pays them lots of money. But actually their day-to-day life is pretty miserable because they spend all their time in the office. They don't see their wife or kids. They're not looking after their health.
Yeah.
They're not getting enough sleep. And is that really what you value when it comes down to it?
Yeah.
And I follow a girl on Instagram, and someone asked her, like, what's your goal in 5 years? And she said to have a good day.
Yeah.
And I really like that, because obviously we are going to set goals for ourselves. It, keeps us motivated. We want to achieve things in our life, but actually just enjoying the day to day is also so important and often so overlooked.
Yeah. And I think it's not about just thinking, okay, well, I can't have goals and I can't be a high achiever, because for some people that might be one of their values.
Yeah.
Might be like they might really enjoy working hard and achieving things and having challenges. So that's absolutely fine. But you've got to also think, okay, well, what also comes with that? If you're, like you said, working yourself to the ground and you're not even seeing your family, or you're not socializing, then is it really worth it? You've got to somehow strike that balance, which is not always doable, but it's just about having the awareness as to, what might be, what one thing might lead to with another in terms of what you might be sacrificing, I guess, and just having that understanding and self-awareness, really.
Yeah. And definitely not just looking at every successful person you see and thinking, oh my gosh, their life's perfect, they've got everything figured out, and my life's a mess and I'm a failure, because that's probably only one small glimpse of their life anyway. But I think that comparison trap is quite dangerous, especially with social media, when we're shown, hundreds of different profiles a day of people who are seemingly living better lives than us.
Yeah. And I say it all the time and everybody knows it, but it really is just a highlights reel. Like, everybody is just showing the good stuff. And I guess it's about putting boundaries in place with yourself as to, if that's not serving you in a positive way, then maybe you need to do something about it. Maybe you need to unfollow that account. Maybe you need to come off social media for a bit. You've got the control to do that. And sometimes, even if you look at an account, if it makes you feel bad about yourself, why are you doing that to yourself? Social media is meant to be, it's something that you can create for yourself. You have full control. You have full reign, really, over your own social media account and the type of content you engage with. So, you know, if you're looking at something on social media and it might be that they're not deliberately doing it to make people feel bad about themselves. They might just be posting, I don't know, they're really happy that they've bought their new car. But if that makes you feel like you're not doing a good enough job and it's, you know, really staying with you in a negative way, maybe you need to just not look at content like that for a while and you have full control of doing that.
But it's so funny because like we've grown up with social media in our lives. I mean, I think I first got Instagram when I was like 14 maybe. So I'm kind of fortunate I didn't have it any younger than that. So I could actually learn things in school. But, you know, we've grown up with this social media where we can compare ourselves to so many different people and we have access to so many people's lives. Whereas even our parents and our grandparents' generation, yes, you'd know people in your immediate village or town, but we didn't see each other's lives in the same way, really. Yeah. And I think, I don't know, I'm kind of envious, really, that wasn't the same experience for us.
Yeah. I mean, it's a completely new experience in a new world, which obviously brings a lot of positives. I mean, I don't think we'd be sat here now if it wasn't for social media, you know, that connected us. But it can also bring negatives as well, which, you know, falls under the mental health umbrella. So it's, it's a really interesting one, I think, social media.
I think just having some of those boundaries with yourself, like you say, unfollowing accounts that aren't helpful to you, obviously trying to limit screen time. I tend to just not go on my phone in the morning until, you know, I've gone for a walk or I've done some exercise, and then when I do look at it I feel like I'm much fresher rather than like that's the first thing I see as soon as I open my eyes. But I want to talk about more generally kind of the landscape of mental health, because I do feel like it's changing. I do feel like people are willing to be more vulnerable and open up online and share things that aren't, you know, perfect. Do you think our approach to mental health is changing on the whole?
Yeah, I think on the whole it is. I think in the UK, I think we tend to be a little bit more behind America with it. I think America's been
everyone's got a therapist.
Yeah, it's really normal for them to just say, yeah, you know, I'm going to therapy, I've got my therapist, my therapist said this. And I think we're getting to that place. But I think there's still, for some people, that slight shame there. And that's something that's so important to me in my practice as well. I don't want people to feel shameful. I almost want them to feel really like proud of that they come to therapy, and I want it to be an enjoyable experience. And that's almost part of the Lux Psychology practice values, is we want it to be a really nice experience for clients. I don't want them to feel like, you know, that they can't, if it comes up in conversation with friends or family, that they can't share that with them. And I have lots of clients that will say to me, oh yeah, I said to my mum, you know, Jade said this, and I said to my friend, my therapist said this. And I think that's so nice that they feel so comfortable to do that. And I think, so yeah, I think it is changing slowly, and we are getting a bit more mental health aware. Everybody sort of has that awareness of that we do have mental health. It's completely normal. It's the same as physical health, as people say. And I think we're doing a lot more in society and like in education about it. There's more promotion around it. I still think, you know, there's a long way to go when it comes to it. And I still think there's some people that think if they go to therapy, there must be something wrong with them. Or, you know, if they've got any difficulty in their life with their mental health, that there's clearly something wrong. I think that's still a stigma that unfortunately is still there, but hopefully over time, we're going in the right direction, I think.
Yeah, it's a message I've said lots of times, like on this podcast and to people in my life, that you don't have to be at breaking point to start therapy, or even to be, you know, suffering in some way. It could just be that you want to do a bit more self-exploration and talk to a professional. Like that was one of the main reasons that I wanted to start therapy. But even my mom was like, you don't need therapy. Like, why? What are you going to therapy for? And I kind of explained it, and obviously she understood it. And actually after we had that conversation, she was so intrigued by the process, and, you know, was checking in with me and things. So I think sometimes there's a bit of a generational gap as well in terms of how we talk about our mental health.
Yeah, and I think it all comes down to like an educational perspective. I think if people don't have that understanding and education around it, how are they going to know, you know, what therapy does or what therapy is? Some people have never been to therapy before, and that's absolutely fine, but they don't know what the process looks like. They might think it's like, I don't know, lying on like a chaise lounge couch like Freud used to do back in the day. But actually, the reality is sometimes it's, you know, on video call.
Yeah, just a chat on video call.
Yeah, or, you know, obviously I've got clients that come into the offices as well, and the rooms are like almost set up like this podcast studio, and it's really like a lovely environment. So actually, I think people's understanding of what therapy is, also they just might not have that education around it, which is completely fine. Nobody's really been there to educate them about it. So that's why I think it's important, you know, for practitioners like myself to be able to speak out about it and explain to people, you know, what goes on in therapy. It's almost like this like kept secret, which it shouldn't be. I think it should be something that everybody can have the experience of.
Do you know the actor Jonah Hill?
Yeah.
He did a short Netflix documentary that was him with his therapist.
Yeah.
And I thought that was so amazing because obviously he's this actor, but he particularly does a lot of roles where he's, you know, the funny guy and is very like comedic. And then you see him being so open and vulnerable with this therapist that he spent all this time with. And it was so interesting as a viewer to have that insight into a therapy session and the conversations that take place and how, you know, they've supported each other. I thought that was so powerful.
Yeah, I've seen that as well. And I think therapy is obviously completely confidential. So it's not something that typically is televised or recorded. But there is the odd TV show and documentary that out there that I think people should watch if they're interested in. I think that one's a really good example. There's also a series on BBC, Couples Therapy, which is like an insight into real life couples therapy, which is fascinating. So there are things out there. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of it because of the nature of the work being confidential. It's not really, you know, clients don't really want to be televised or recorded, which is completely fine. But I think if more content was out there, then people would have a better understanding as to what therapy is and what's involved.
Yeah, definitely. And remove some of the stigma or like the scariness around it, I think, as well. But why do you think a lot of young people in particular are struggling with their mental health, particularly with things like anxiety?
I think it sort of goes back to social media and the world that we're living in this day and age. It's naturally adding a lot of extra pressure that maybe didn't exist back in the day. So naturally that's going to have a knock-on effect on people's mental health and might lead to anxiety or depression, low mood, eating disorders, things like that. So I think the world that we're living in this day and age, and the world that young people are growing up in, like you said, you know, people are now growing up and social media is just a norm, but we can remember a time where it didn't exist. But there's people there that can't imagine a time that social media just wasn't a thing. And also I think with social media and technology in general, we do also see a lack of interaction as well. So, you know, lots of children aren't playing on their bikes together and going to the park and doing things like that. They're like gaming and they're speaking to each other online, and that's their way of interacting, but actually it's not a typical way of interacting with somebody. And I think you could also use like COVID as an example. That limit of interaction had such a negative impact on people's mental health, completely understandably. And we're social creatures, you know, as humans. We are built to be surrounded by people. We're like pack animals. We're not meant to be isolated. And when people are isolated, that's when we see a rise in mental health difficulties.
Yeah, it's so true. All of that makes so much sense. If you think about somebody who was maybe joining secondary school around the time of COVID, they aren't seeing their friends. They aren't seeing people at school. They're spending all of their time on social media. And yes, they might speak to people online, but it's not a fix for like in-person social connection.
Yeah.
But something I do wonder is, do you think we self-diagnose mental health conditions too often?
Oh, what a good question. I think we have more awareness and we have more labels for it now. So now we're able to differentiate if somebody's depressed, whereas back in the day it would just be, oh, you're just having a down day. So I think there's more labels for it. There's more of an understanding as to what it might be. I do think labels get thrown around a lot.
Yeah.
And I think people, for example, use the term depression a lot. Everybody experiences anxiety, but having like chronic anxiety versus having being in an anxious state because you've got an exam or something, that's completely normal. You've got to identify, how long is it going on for? And as a psychologist, if I was making a clinical diagnosis, it's got to be that it's long term. It's long term and it's impacting their life in a significant way. We don't just hand out diagnoses, willy-nilly to people. There's got to be significant evidence that it's impacting their life. But I think there's a lot of self-diagnosis. You've just got to type it into Google and it will give you like a huge range of, you might be experiencing depression, you might be experiencing bipolar, you might be experiencing personality disorder. And I think even with personality disorders, that's, again, an area of my expertise in my clinical work. And you find young people will think that they've got a personality disorder. And actually, in terms of diagnoses of it, I personally would not diagnose a personality disorder until somebody's over the age of 18 because hormones play such a huge role, puberty, and it can show up like a personality disorder. So we've got to be really careful when it comes to throwing those labels around, I think. And I think, narcissism is also a bit of a trend at the moment. And I mean, everybody can probably identify somebody who is narcissistic, but whether you meet criteria for narcissistic personality disorder is something
I didn't even know
different.
That was a personality disorder.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, narcissistic personality disorder. But it's really hard to diagnose that because that requires the person, who's seeking the diagnosis to identify that there is a problem.
Yeah.
And based on their characteristics, they're not likely to do that.
Yeah.
So trying to, diagnose that is quite a difficult one. But I do think that there's a lot of self-diagnosis out there. So I think it has its positives because people have more of an understanding as to what they might be going through might be more complex than just, they're having a down day, or what they're going through with another person. That person was just not very nice to them. Actually, it might be that person was really, struggling with something and actually left them with trauma. So I think, it has its positives, but also has its negatives because it can lead to false labeling.
Yeah, I completely understand that and definitely agree with your point. And I also think sometimes when we give ourselves these labels, maybe without that professional diagnosis as well, it sort of becomes a crutch or a way that we can excuse certain behaviors. If someone's, I don't know, feeling quite attached in a relationship, they might say, oh, it's my anxious attachment style, or my ex was a narcissist. We kind of use these blanket terms to mean lots of different things because it's easier, or like you say, it's become a bit trendy to kind of use that.
And I think that's absolutely fine to use terms like that because it shows that you've maybe had a good understanding of something, of an experience or the way that you're behaving. So I think it's okay to maybe say that, but I think it's because on one hand, like I said, it has the positives of maybe help somebody to understand a certain experience. But on the other hand, if it's impacting your behaviour and maybe you're not doing anything about it, then it can become problematic. If it, like you said, if it's just an excuse, if it's a way of avoiding something. And I'll say to clients, I will treat everybody, whether you've got like an official diagnosis, if you come to me with an official diagnosis and a letter to say that you've got a certain personality disorder or whatever, and I have a client who presents with the exact same symptoms or issues, I will still treat you in the same way. I'll still support you both in the same way, regardless of whether you've got a diagnosis or not, because I'm just dealing with what you're bringing to the sessions and what you're struggling with. So actually, whether you have a label or not, to me in clinical practice is not irrelevant, but it doesn't change the way that I work with somebody.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Like, your goal, I guess, is to give people the education and the tools to support themselves in the best way possible, and also work through things that might be difficult or challenging in their life. So I guess in that sense, it doesn't really matter if you've got this official diagnosis or not. So that's super interesting. And yeah, thank you for bringing up that point. But you've shared so much good advice on this podcast today. Honestly, it's been so enlightening for me, and I'm sure it has for all the listeners as well. But I do ask every guest the same question, which is, if you had to give one piece of advice to help people achieve their personal best, what would it be?
Oh, name your inner critic.
Yeah.
And start and challenge the way that you speak to yourself, I think would be my piece of advice.
Definitely. I'm going to think of a name after this podcast episode.
You'll have to let me know.
I will. Thank you so much. And where can people go if they want to find you, check out any of the work that you're doing, or your clinic as well?
Yeah, so you can find me on Instagram at Dr Jade Official. You can find my clinic Instagram at Lux Psychology Practice, and then our website is www.luxpsychologypractice.com.
Amazing. Thank you so much. It's been so great to chat, and thank you everybody for listening.